Welcome back, everyone. We are now reviewing episode 6 of X-Men 97, 6 episodes out of 10. This is Life Death Part 2. Now, this show has been like a. I'll just say it. For the first 2 episodes, I said this show is amazing. Let's see where it goes. For the third episode, I was actually more positive, one of the more positive people on it. I said this show is 10 out of 10. This is amazing. Then episode 4 came out, and most people agreed that it was a pretty bad episode. It was very meh. It didn't get a lot of discussion around it. One person said that it was like this episode that had 2 stories into one. It was a split episode. One story felt like it was half baked. The other one was on fast forward. And the episode that was on fast forward was Life Death Part 1, the stuff with Storm dealing with her powers, trying to get him back, and that it just did not have a lot of development. But I thought, well, we'll give it a chance until we get the Part 2 of it. Then we got episode 5, and it made everyone think that episode 4 didn't even happen, and a lot of people gave it a 10 out of 10. I thought that from a writing perspective, it was the best episode in the series. It was very shocking. They went to areas that I had thought that they were going to go like E for Extinction, but it did it in ways that still managed to shock me. I had a problem with some gross stuff in the episode, but other than that, it was really, it really blew it out of the water for my expectations of this show and where I thought that they were going to go, and it made Gambit a very, very popular character. I'm so glad he's getting a lot of recognition and that people are seeing how amazing he is, and that hopefully that'll convince the Disney execs to use him when we get the first iteration of X-Men on screen. I wish I could say the same for Rogue, but we'll talk about that another time because these are not the characters that are featured in this episode. This is an episode, once again, it's called Life Death Part 2. It was supposed to be about the finishing up of Storm's arc, about her getting her powers back, and it is based off of a very famous comic by Chris Claremont about Storm losing her powers and having to deal with that. And, but this episode, once again, the quality of the show has been good to great to bad to amazing with some caveats to that, to this episode, which is just fine. It's just fine. From an entertainment perspective, I didn't have any, I would say, major qualms with it or major praises, but it was a little bit of a bait and switch for me because this episode was Life Death Part 2. I thought we were going to get a lot of Storm, but once again, her story, even though this is called Life Death Part 2, which is a very famous arc for her, she is once again regulated to a B plot in the show. This show is actually about Charles Xavier and what's happening to him and Lilandra and him needing to come back to the X-Men. So, that, just for me personally, it depends on what you want from this episode. If you're just fine with just seeing Charles Xavier hang out with the Shi'ar and what's going on with him, then you'll probably like it. But the Storm stuff has just been so rushed in this show. And what I like, and I'll talk about what I like about it in this episode, it just feels like you're taking a very famous plotline and you're condensing it into something else where you could have spent a lot more time on it. Because for me personally, with the Charles Xavier storyline, I am just not that invested in the Charles and Lilandra stuff. It's mainly about him trying to get the Shi'ar to accept him. And with that, there is a theme that we are going to see tie into the entire show, I think, which is about how we are all children of the atom. We're all the same at our core. But I just didn't feel like we needed an entire episode, and it takes up most of the episode to explore that. And it felt like the stuff with Charles Xavier was a bit slow, and it felt like the stuff with Storm was too fast, and that was a little bit of the pacing imbalance, not nearly on the same level that I had with episode 4, but you can see that a little bit. This show is just kind of a roller coaster to watch, and something I wanted to talk about with it is I've never had this with a show or a movie, I think, ever, where there was no way for me to predict what was going to happen next, where my expectations would just blow up each time, whether in a good way or a bad way, where I just could not know what the show was gonna go, and I couldn't really get into the writers' heads of, okay, where are you going with this now? Obviously, I mentioned E for Extinction, that was kind of obvious, like stuff like Madeline Pryor being actually the Cyclops' wife, and Mr. Sinister being a major villain in the show, and Bastion coming in. Like, some of these were leaked, some of these were shown in the trailers, like stuff like that was kind of obvious, but I think that the reason why it's so difficult to predict where the show is going to go is number one, they're very, very good at keeping spoilers. There have been some spoilers that have leaked out, like the X-Men are going to get new suits, supposedly. We already see one of those in this show. But I think that they've been very good at keeping spoilers and the more shocking moments. But in other cases, I think that it's because this show is moving at such an inconsistent pace where sometimes it will be incredibly fast-paced and we can go to areas from comics that I never thought we would even get to so quickly. And I think also because it's taken a while to really understand what they were going for with this show because they were hiding it. They started out as being just sort of an homage to the 90s show, and now it's kind of branched out and become its own thing and explored much darker subject matter and much more adult things than that show ever would have. And so that's just me saying that it is wildly unpredictable to watch. Going back to the stuff I liked about the show, though, I did like the Storm stuff. I was disappointed because Storm and Forge are a good couple in the comics, but the problem is they just didn't give them enough time in this show to develop to that point. You've got Storm calling Forge my love, and it's like, but they've been together for like 5 minutes. You know, we didn't really get to spend time with the fact that he was the person who created the technology for the inhibitor collars and whatnot. And so it's like you just need more room to breathe. Another question I had with this Storm storyline is that in the comics, Storm is a character who would say that she has never ever thought about being anything other than a mutant. And the purpose of her life-death storyline is about how she essentially is a dead woman walking without these powers, that she cannot accept herself without them. And they kind of do that in the show by making Forge talk her up as being just fine the way she is as a human. But the show, in a greater capacity, has made it so that she was a person who was regretting her powers and wishing that she didn't have them, and that this episode is about her not letting the fear of her powers get the best of her, which leads to a great sequence of her getting her powers back, and the theme song that rolls in is amazing, and she has just a glow up getting them back, getting her classic suit from the comics with the white flowing hair, the tiara, the black. I have never been a fan of the white on white suit with the shoulder pads. I've always thought it looked ugly. Was not a fan of the mohawk either, even though I wasn't as mad as it as other people. But to see her in her classic outfit and to be flying around next to the horses, that looked amazing. She looks amazing. I can't wait to see her back with the team. However, it does make me question like the consistency of them doing this plot line. It's like in the comics, we know that this can be separate from the comics. It's about life death is specifically referring to her being a dead woman walking without these powers, and that she needs to learn that to embrace herself without these powers. In the show, they like do that, but also do that she doesn't want these powers. So it's like they changed it to tie into their own theme, which is supposed to be about embracing who you are, even though Storm isn't really used in that traditionally, but they don't really keep that consistent, and that's a bit of my problem. So from an entertainment perspective, this episode is just fine. Like there's no character assassinations, there's no, there's the pacing was off, but it wasn't, terrible. It's just that I was hoping for a little more from it, I think. And but next week we're gonna get right back into the turmoil of this show, and there are a couple things I want to talk about now that maybe I'm getting more of an idea of where we're going. A couple predictions for you. This seems to clearly foreshadow Gambit coming back as his comic book form of Death, which is one of the Horsemen of Apocalypse. Basically, he's transformed into this villainous character, and that's how he's gonna come back from dead in this show. It might play out differently in the show than it does in the comics. In the comics, it was a very controversial and very poorly done storyline of him becoming Death. Basically came down to him, I guess, assuming that Rogue had chosen somebody other than him, even though that wasn't the case. But you can see how they're playing with that. So we'll see how that works out in this show. It's interesting how this show does not shy away from going to controversial storylines and trying to make some things out of them. Sometimes it's worked, sometimes it hasn't. I'm interested to see what happens next, but one thing that I wanted to point out about this episode, is that when Charles Xavier has his vision of the genocide, he does not see Magneto in that vision, which tells me that Magneto is still alive. It was probably because Leech was right there leeching off his powers, and that hid them from the Sentinel, and Magneto's going to turn evil again. So that's kind of the only thing I can predict, and that's kind of been shown in the trailer. So at least we're done with any Magneto nonsense, hopefully. But once again, that's about as far as I can predict with this show. Like, once again, it's so wild, and the quality of each episode can be so different from the last, and the pacing can be so different, and the areas we go through from whatever era of comics we're picking from is so different. Like, I would not be a bit surprised, because people were talking about how Nightcrawler, and by the way, we get Nightcrawler as one of the team members of this episode, and I really love that. I love anything with Nightcrawler. I'm glad that they're going to do more with him. But, you know, that scene back in episode 5 of Nightcrawler mentioning that Gambit should just marry Rogue, they are married in the current comics. I would not be a bit surprised if this season ends with that. And that is, to me, to say that this show just goes, like, to places just so quickly. It's, like, almost impossible. Like, they could completely not go in that direction. This show just sort of jumps around with what it's going to adapt, and that's why you never know what's going to happen. But it's going to be interesting to review it when it all wraps up and you get the full context. What do you think about this show? What do you think is going to happen in this show? Was this episode really good for you? Are you enjoying the overall show, or do you have a lot of problems with it? Thank you, patrons, as always, for supporting this channel. Got a new short film coming out that I'm finishing up today. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you guys next time.